So China is experiencing a huge wave of protests, believed to be the biggest protest since Tiananmen Square in 1989. And it's all kicked off because of the zero COVID policy, almost 3 years of on-off lockdowns. Some of the most extreme restrictions in the world seem to have pushed people to breaking point. Tom, you've written about these protests this week. Do you want to say a bit about them? I mean, just first of all, it seems like the bravery of these protesters is extraordinary given the circumstances.
No, completely, especially because the pretty fearsome regime of state surveillance and censorship has, if anything, been bolstered over the period of the pandemic for obvious reasons. So the courage of these people to come out onto the streets and to, in many cases, not simply protesting against the lockdown restrictions, so that's certainly a core part of it and the trigger for a lot of what we're seeing now, but actually, you know, saying the unthinkable and that it's time for Xi Jinping or for the CCP to step down. Direct protests against, I say direct, but kind of the white paper, blank sheet of paper protests against state censorship. So what you're really seeing is this morphing into a pretty significant challenge and affront to the ruling regime. It's been building up for a good few weeks now. I don't know if people remember during the Chinese Communist Party's Congress, there was the bridge man who unveiled these banners over a bridge in Beijing, not only rehearsing slogans around COVID, saying we want food, we don't want PCR tests, but also saying we want to be citizens, not slaves, calling for Xi Jinping to step down and so on. And since then, we've just sort of continued to see kind of unrest pop up here or there, often focusing around the COVID rules. There were this remarkable scenes at the Foxconn kind of iPhone plant, which is this huge facility in central China where about half of the world's iPhones are made, where you had loads of workers, sort of internal migrant workers, just completely disappear one day. A few hundred of them left to try and avoid the quarantine rules, which have become incredibly punishing. We've seen other scenes there. Obviously in Xinjiang, which has been in lockdown for like 3 months now, and under, it seems like, more punishing restrictions in other areas. We've seen protests there. We've also seen protests in the south, people breaking through the kind of COVID barriers and physically clashing with the kind of hazmat-suited officials there. And then also this spreading to the cities and to students as well, who are more explicitly kind of, in many cases, chanting kind of anti-regime slogans. So it's really significant. Of course, everyone reaches for the Tiananmen example. Often it's not necessarily that useful, but whilst you could say this is naturally very different to 1989, it is still the most significant kind of movement we've seen since then. And regardless of what happened next, this is a serious challenge, not just to the zero COVID policy, but also to the regime itself. And as you say, you're just left with the remarkable bravery of it, regardless of what happens next.
Sticking to the zero COVID policy for now, I mean, it is extraordinary to see, in the name of safetyism, this allegation that in Xinjiang, people were essentially left to burn to death, caught up in a fire. Lockdown rules supposed to save people's lives, but actually hindering people's ability to escape. Rakib, what have you made of that kind of extremism, I guess?
Oh, I think that's the correct term to use. It is extremist policy. A lot of the COVID, zero COVID policies that we've seen implemented by the Chinese Communist Party, utterly dehumanizing, if truth be told. And it's actually no surprise to me that even though such an authoritarian regime is in place, you can see the level of public dissent against those policies. And I think more widely, we've seen this week that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, saying that the golden era of UK-China relations is over. And I think further down the line, when it comes to foreign policy, I'd like to see the UK continue to criticise the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And also, I think that we need to invest more in alliances such as the D10, which is essentially a club of democracies, which incorporates the Group of Seven, but also Australia, South Korea, and India, which essentially looks to reduce those democracies' collective economic dependence on China.
And in terms of the sort of foreign aspect, Tom, I mean, there has been... Obviously, the criticism of the Chinese regime is warranted, but there is an element of brass neck with some people coming out supporting the protest, particularly Justin Trudeau. of course, he's nothing like the CCP, but he's certainly on the authoritarian end of the Western liberal kind of
I think
lockdowners.
Yes, exactly. I think his exact words were that the lockdown protesters should be free to express themselves, which will obviously stick in the craw of anyone who watched with horror as Canada at one point was certainly leading the world leading the Western world, we should say, the supposedly free West, in terms of cracking down on dissent around COVID, vaccine mandates, the treatment of the truckers' protests there, not just the demonisation of them, but the treating them effectively as a terrorist threat. And again, clamping down on them, passing pieces of emergency legislation, essentially, and emergency powers, essentially allowing them to starve them of funds and so on and so forth. So to see these people turn around now and pose as sort of warriors for liberalism is more than a bit rich. In a sense, obviously, what we've seen in China has been horrendous, and it's also given the lie to the sort of propaganda of the CCP, which is to say that COVID and the pandemic would almost vindicate their model, if you like, that this is if anything, the world will see the wisdom of this supposedly incredibly efficient, authoritarian, personalist regime. And
collective and socialist and, good for the benefit of all.
All of that is now completely fraying, obviously, because of how things are playing out. Also, incidentally, some of the ridiculous decisions they've made, they haven't actually, their own kind of domestic vaccines are really not up to snuff. They're refusing to actually import any of the kind of Western-made mRNA vaccines for reasons of propaganda and shamefacedness, it seems like, more than anything else. And also, just despite the fact that they're maintaining this incredibly tyrannical lockdown regime, failing to get particularly the most vulnerable and the elderly actually vaccinated. So they kind of find themselves in this tremendous bind. And all of that is now starting to fray. People are watching, heavily censored, but nevertheless still watching kind of images from the World Cup and seeing people, cheek by jowl enjoying themselves and wondering what the hell is going on. But in a sense, we might have expected CCP-led China to take an incredibly authoritarian response to the pandemic. What was always striking about it was that supposedly free West so readily pursued that particular path to suggest that, of course, something has to be done, but we're not going to throw out our whole alleged way of doing things here in relation to freedom and the rule of law and so on. But, in the words of Neil Ferguson, they never thought they would get away with it here, but they did end up getting away with it here. And that's one of the things that is worth reflecting on. So at the moment, we've got the people in China having a reckoning with their own rulers, but we definitely need a reckoning with ours over our own excesses, whilst they might, when you look at what's going on in various parts of China at the moment, pale in comparison, certainly, it's something that warrants thinking about deeply as to why we ended up kind of following that particular path, even in a kind of reduced aspect, if you like.
Yeah, and Rakib, what do you make of the fact that, we obviously didn't go as far as China, but there are some people who, let's say, kind of admired the Chinese approach. And obviously, they are not as authoritarian as the CCP, but people like Jeremy Hunt come to mind, who in 2020 was talking about zero infection, which sounds a bit like zero COVID. Various people on SAGE and that independent SAGE group talking about the Chinese model being preferable or zero COVID being preferable. I mean, how should we reckon with that? It's quite alarming, really.
It is, Fraser. And I think if I remember correctly, that there was an individual involved in the independent SAGE group who was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain.
Susan Mickey, she was part of SAGE.
She was part of SAGE and Independent SAGE, opposing herself.
So, no, I agree. I think that we did have certain politicians who promoting I wouldn't say a strict approach. It was dangerously close to some of the zero COVID policies that we saw being implemented in China, and I think, to be honest, there wasn't much intellectual depth in terms of really examining what could be the negative side effects of those policies. That's what I felt at the time. We see now, for example, a record number of children being admitted to language therapy because there's such a lack of social interaction under lockdown. Their linguistic development has really suffered as a result of that. There's that phenomenon of absent children, children just not returning to school, exceptionally high rates of absences. So I think that those kind of possible outcomes, which have now materialized, I don't think they were even being talked about very much at all. And of course, there were groups which were vulnerable, more vulnerable than other groups to COVID, but there wasn't much discussion about mental well-being. people, for example, who are living on their own in fairly tiny flats. What kind of impact would those lockdown restrictions have on their mental health? I just felt that many of those conversations were needed, but they weren't really had.
And you are just reminded like how much us as human beings the world over, you just need freedom and you need one another. And as soon as those things are choked off, even in the relatively limited sense as it was over here, or the incredibly extreme means in which that has taken place in China, even just your ability to go about your daily business just completely taken away from you. What a profound and corrosive impact that has, the human toll of all of that, all the horror stories from China that you've seen of suicides through to people not being able to get treatment for their ill children in time and so on and so forth. You're seeing that even in places like China, which often there is this kind of caricature of they're just very compliant, aren't they? They prioritize stability and in the case of the kind of upper middle class, some kind of economic advancement over these broader appeals. You are just seeing that kind of yearning for a properly kind of free, and in many cases the more radical extent of these protests, actually democratic kind of life, is still kind of not been extinguished. And that's incredibly inspiring, even if it took a lot of horrendous things to get us to this particular point with these protests.